Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts. It boosts the story to thousands more. Collier Brennan woke to the sound that every man in the territory feared most. The thunder of horses moving as one, not 10, not 20. When he opened his eyes and saw the dust rising beyond his window, he knew it was more than he could count. 150 Apache warriors surrounded his cabin in a perfect circle, and at the center of it all, a single figure sat mounted on a dark horse, wearing a war bonnet. That caught the first light of dawn. Inside Collier's cabin, in his own bed, two Apache women still slept. One of them had been burning with fever just hours before. The other had looked at him with eyes that expected nothing but cruelty. And now their father had arrived with enough warriors to wipe his homestead from existence. Collier had no weapon within reach, no plan, no way out. All he had was the memory of what he'd done the night before, and no idea if that would save him or seal his fate. The previous evening had started like any other. Collier had been checking the fence line on the eastern edge of his property when he noticed them. Two figures moving slowly across the open ground, one practically carrying the other. Even from a distance, he could see they were struggling. His first instinct was to turn away. The territory had been tense for months. Settlers and tribes avoiding each other when they could, clashing when they couldn't. Smart men stayed out of it. Smart men minded their own business. But Collier had never been particularly smart about suffering. He'd watched his own wife deteriorate from fever years back, helpless to do anything but hold her hand while she slipped away. The way one of those figures stumbled reminded him of those final days. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was walking toward them. When they saw him coming, the stronger one stepped in front of the other, her hand moving to something at her waist. Keir stopped and raised both hands, showing he was unarmed. For a long moment, neither side moved. Then the weaker one collapsed, and the decision made itself. Up close, he could see they were young women, sisters, maybe dressed in traditional clothing that had seen hard travel. The one still standing had eyes like flint, sharp, untrusting, ready for violence. The one on the ground was barely conscious, her skin hot enough that Collier could feel the fever radiating off her before he even touched her. "I have shelter," he said, pointing toward his cabin. "Water, a bed." The standing sister said something in a language he didn't understand, her tone making it clear she was refusing. But when her sister tried to stand and immediately fell back down, something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not gratitude, just calculation. Weighing the danger of accepting help against the certainty of what would happen if she didn't, she nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Collier got the fevered one to her feet, letting her lean her full weight against him. The healthy sister walked behind them, and Collier could feel her eyes on his back the entire way to the cabin. He didn't blame her. If their situations were reversed, he'd be watching too. Inside, he guided them straight to his bed, the only real bed in the place. The healthy sister immediately began protesting, but Collier was already pulling back the covers and helping her sister down onto the mattress. He brought water, cool cloth for the fever, and what little food he had that might settle gently in his sick stomach. The healthy sister watched everything he did with the intensity of someone memorizing evidence for a trial. Every gesture, every movement, like she was building a case in her mind about what kind of man he was and what he might want in return. Collier understood that look. He'd seen it on animals caught in traps, on travelers who'd lost their way and had to trust a stranger for directions. It was the look of someone who'd learned that help always came with a price. He pulled a chair to the corner of the room, far enough away to not be threatening, close enough to help if the fever spiked worse. The healthy sister positioned herself between him and the bed, never fully relaxing. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would cross the canyon of mistrust between them. Hours passed. The fever broke sometime past midnight. The six sisters' breathing evened out, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the healthy one's shoulders dropped from their rigid defensive position. She looked at Collier across the dim cabin, and something in her expression had changed. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. That's when Collier heard the first sound outside. Distant, rhythmic, the sound of many horses moving through darkness. He stood and moved to the window, careful not to wake the sisters. Through the glass, he could see nothing but night and stars. But he could feel it, something massive approaching through the dark, something that was coming specifically for this cabin. And whatever it was, it would arrive by dawn. The healthy sister had heard it too. She was sitting upright, now, her hand moving again to whatever she kept at her waist, her eyes locked on the door. For the first time since they had arrived, Keir saw something in her expression that looked like fear. Not fear of him, fear of what was coming. Dawn came slowly, turning the darkness into shades of gray before finally surrendering to light. Collier stood at the window, his body rigid with tension, watching the horizon. The sound of horses had grown steadily louder through the last hours of night, and now he could see them, shadows taking shape in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the coordination of a military unit. They emerged from the gray light like a vision from a nightmare. Dozens of riders, then more, then so many that trying to count them felt pointless. They spread out in a perfect circle around his property, each warrior positioned exactly where they needed to be to ensure nothing and no one could escape. It was the kind of tactical formation that took years of warfare to master. Keir's mouth went dry. He'd heard stories from other settlers about Apache war parties, but those stories always involved a handful of warriors conducting quick raids. This wasn't a raid. This was an army. At the center of the formation, one rider moved forward on a dark horse. Even from a distance, Keir could see the war bonnet, the long trail of feathers that marked him as someone of significant importance. A chief, a war leader, someone who commanded the loyalty of 150 warriors. Behind him in the cabin, both sisters still slept. The fevered one had finally found peace after hours of restless tossing. The healthy one had eventually allowed exhaustion to claim her, though even in sleep, her hand remained near her waist, ready to grab whatever weapon she kept hidden there. Keir looked at them, then back at the warriors outside. The math was simple and brutal. A man didn't bring that many warriors to negotiate. He brought them to make a statement, to deliver justice, to ensure that whatever happened next, there would be no ambiguity about who held the power. The question that haunted Collier was simpler. Justice for what? He'd given them shelter, water, his own bed. He'd sat in a chair all night, keeping watch over two sick and vulnerable women, making sure the fever didn't spike into something worse. He'd touched them only to help, to steady them when they stumbled, to place cool cloths on burning skin. He'd asked for nothing and expected nothing in return. But would they see it that way? Would their father, the healthy sister, had watched him with suspicion all night? What if she'd seen threat and gestures meant to help? What if kindness looked like opportunity to someone who'd learned to expect the worst from strangers? What if the story she told her father wasn't the story Keir thought he'd been living? The rider at the center of the formation moved closer. Collier could see his face now, weathered by years of sun and wind, eyes hard with the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. This was a man who'd led warriors into battle and brought them home. A man who'd made decisions about life and death so many times that they no longer weighed heavy on his conscience. This was a man who would do whatever needed to be done. The formation tightened. Warriors who'd been spread wide across the property began moving inward, closing the circle. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it was deliberate. They were eliminating options, making sure that if violence became necessary, it would be swift and absolute. Collier glanced at the rifle mounted above the door. He could reach it in 3 steps, loaded in seconds. But what then? Fight 150 warriors? Defending a cabin that wasn't worth defending while 2 women slept in his bed? The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of trouble, kept to himself, stayed away from the conflicts between settlers and tribes, built his life in a place remote enough that the world's problems couldn't find him. And now those problems had ridden up to his door with the morning sun, and the only choice left was how he would face them. The leader raised one hand. The formation stopped moving. Every warrior sat perfectly still on their horse, waiting for the next command. The silence was absolute. 150 men and horses, making no sound at all. Behind Collier, one of the sisters stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't understand. The leader's hand dropped, and the warriors began to dismount. The sound of warriors dismounting, leather creaking, weapons shifting, boots hitting earth finally woke them. Collier heard movement behind him and turned to see both sisters sitting upright in bed, their eyes wide and locked on the window. The healthy sister was on her feet, instantly moving to the glass. When she saw what waited outside, her entire body went rigid. She spoke rapidly in her own language, words tumbling out too fast for Collier to catch, even if he'd understood them. The fevered sister, still weak but conscious, pulled herself to the edge of the bed and looked out. Her reaction was different. Not fear, something closer to resignation, like she'd known this moment was coming and had simply hoped for more time. The healthy sister turned to Collier, and, for the first time since they'd met, she spoke words he could understand. Broken, heavily accented, but clear enough. "You die now." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a translation of what she saw when she looked at the warriors outside and the white man who'd sheltered them. In her world, there was only one way this story could end. Collier found himself nodding. She was probably right. A man didn't survive 150 warriors by luck or cleverness. He survived by not being there in the first place. But that option had closed the moment he decided to help two strangers who'd needed it. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I'm going out there anyway." Both sisters looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Staying inside meant dying in a cabin with the door broken down, trapped like an animal with nowhere to run. Going outside meant dying in the open, but at least he'd face it standing. He moved toward the door, but the healthy sister stepped in front of him, blocking his path. She said something sharp and urgent, pointing at him, then at the bed, then at the floor. He didn't need a translator. She was telling him to hide, to stay down, to let them handle this. But handle how? Walk out there and explain that the white man who'd housed them all night had been harmless, that he'd only helped. Would their father believe that? Would it even matter if he did? Collier gently moved her aside. She resisted for a moment, then stepped back, her expression shifting from urgency to something that looked almost like respect, or maybe just acceptance of a fool who'd made a choice. He checked a rifle one more time, then deliberately left it mounted above the door. Walking out there armed would be suicide. Walking out there unarmed might also be suicide, but at least it wouldn't be a declaration of war. His hands settled on the door handle. Through the window, he could see the leader still mounted on his horse, waiting. The warriors had formed a tighter circle now, close enough that Collier could see individual faces, young men and old, some with scars that told stories of previous battles. All of them watching his cabin with the focus of predators who'd cornered their prey. Behind him, the fevered sister spoke. Her voice was weak but clear, and though Collier didn't understand the words, he understood the tone. She was telling her sister something important. A confession maybe, or an explanation. The healthy sister responded, her voice sharp with emotion, anger, fear, or maybe both. They argued for several seconds, their voices rising until finally the healthy sister turned to Collier. "She say you, good man." The words came out reluctant, like admitting them cost something. "She say you no hurt us. She say you give bed, give water." She paused, struggling. With the next words, "She say tell father truth." Kier nodded slowly. "Will he believe you?" The healthy sister looked out the window at the mounted leader, and for the first time, Collier saw genuine fear cross her face. Not fear of what her father might do to Collier, fear of what he might do to her for trusting a stranger, for accepting help from someone who should have been an enemy. "I not know," she whispered, and that Kier realized was the most honest answer he was going to get. He opened the door and stepped into the morning light. Every warrior's eyes shifted to him instantly. The leader's gaze was particularly intense, measuring, evaluating, deciding. Collier forced himself to walk forward, his hands visible and empty at his sides. Each step felt like it might be his last. When he was 10 feet from the mounted leader, he stopped. The man looked down at him from horseback, his face unreadable. Then, very slowly, the leader began to dismount. The leader's feet touched earth, and the shift in dynamics was immediate. On horseback, he'd been imposing on the ground, standing face to face with Collier. He was something else entirely. A man whose presence filled the space around him like physical weight. He was shorter than Collier by a few inches, but it didn't matter. Authority had nothing to do with height. He studied Collier in silence. Not the quick assessment of an enemy in battle, but the slow, thorough examination of someone reading a man's entire character through his posture, his eyes, his breathing. Collier forced himself to stand still under that scrutiny, resisting every instinct that screamed at him to look away, to move, to do something other than stand exposed under that penetrating gaze. The leader's eyes moved past Collier to the cabin, to the door that still stood open to the two figures now visible in the doorway. His daughters, one leaning heavily on the other. Something flickered across his face. Then not relief exactly. Something harder to name. Recognition. Maybe confirmation. That what he'd been told was true. His daughters were here, alive, standing in a white man's doorway at dawn. The fevered sister called out, her voice still weak but urgent. She spoke rapidly in their language, the words tumbling over each other. The healthy sister joined in, supporting her sister physically and apparently verbally, adding her own account to whatever story was being told. The leader's expression remained unreadable as he listened. Collier stood motionless, understanding nothing but feeling everything. The weight of judgment, the balance of his life hanging on words he couldn't comprehend. When the sisters finished speaking, silence settled over the property again. The leader looked at Collier, then back at his daughters, then at the open door of the cabin. He moved forward, walking past Collier as if he wasn't there. And Collier felt every warrior's hand tense on their weapons, ready to act if their leader was threatened. But the leader showed no concern. He walked straight to the cabin and stepped inside. Kier stayed where he was, not daring to follow, while 150 warriors watched him with the focus of men who'd been given orders to protect their leader at any cost. Minutes passed. Collier could hear voices from inside, the sisters speaking, their father responding in low tones that carried weight even through the walls. He heard movement, footsteps, the creak of floorboards. The healthy sister appeared in the doorway, her expression complex and conflicted. She looked at Collier, then gestured sharply for him to come inside. It wasn't a request. Whatever was happening in there, he was being summoned to be part of it. Collier walked toward the cabin, acutely aware that every step was being watched by warriors who could end his life before he took another breath. He reached the doorway and stepped inside. The leader stood in the center of the room, looking at the bed where his daughters had slept, at the pitch of water on the side table, at the chair in the corner where Collier had kept watch all night. His hand touched the blanket, feeling its texture, and something in his expression shifted, a softening so slight that Collier almost missed it. He spoke, his voice deep and measured, each word given deliberate weight. The healthy sister translated, her English halting, but clear enough. "My daughters say you give them shelter, water, your own bed." She paused, struggling with the next phrase. "You stay awake. Keep watch. Make sure. Fever not kill." Collier nodded once. There was nothing to add. Those were the facts. The leader continued speaking, and the sister translated again. "You know, touch them. No ask for trade. No ask for anything." "No," Collier said quietly. I didn't ask for anything. The leader stepped closer, his eyes searching Kier's face with that same penetrating intensity. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow more dangerous, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The sister translated, "Why?" It was the simplest question and the hardest to answer. Why had he helped? Why risk everything for two? Strangers who should have been enemies? Why give up his safety for people he'd never see again? Collier thought about his wife, about watching her slip away while he sat helpless, about the fever that had taken her and the emptiness it had left behind, about seeing that same fever in a stranger's eyes and being unable to walk away from it. Because I could, he finally said, because they needed help and I could give it. The leader studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin, gesturing for Collier to follow. Outside, the warriors remained in formation, but something had shifted in their posture. They no longer looked like men preparing for violence. They looked like men waiting for orders they already suspected were coming. The leader walked to the center of the circle, to a space where all his warriors could see him clearly. Kier followed, his legs feeling unsteady, but his head clear. Whatever was about to happen would determine whether he saw another sunset. The leader raised one hand, and the warriors moved closer, tightening the circle until they formed an audience rather than a siege. He spoke to them in a voice that carried across the morning air, words flowing with the rhythm of someone accustomed to addressing groups, to making pronouncements that would be remembered and repeated. Collier couldn't understand the language, but he could read the reactions. Some warriors nodded slowly, their expressions thoughtful. Others looked surprised, their eyes shifting between their leader and the white man who stood beside him. A few looked skeptical, arms crossed over their chests, clearly questioning whatever they were being told. The leader continued speaking, his tone growing more emphatic. He pointed at the cabin, at his daughters, who now stood in the doorway watching. He pointed at Collier, not with accusation, but with something that looked almost like presentation, showing his warriors something they needed to see and understand. When he finished speaking, silence hung over the property. Then one warrior stepped forward, then another, then several more. They approached Collier, and for a heart-topping moment, he thought the judgment had gone against him after all. But they didn't reach for weapons. They reached out their hands, not for a handshake in the white man's tradition, but with palms pressed briefly to their chests before extending toward him, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. The leader spoke again, shorter this time, and turned to Collier. The healthy sister had moved closer, ready to translate. Fathers say, you show honor when no have to. You risk everything for strangers. She paused, her voice catching slightly. You say you are a good man in a world with not many good men. Kier didn't know how to respond to that. He'd only done what seemed right at the moment without thinking about honor or risk or anything beyond the immediate need in front of him. The leader continued speaking, and the sister kept translating. He say his people, remember this. Remember you. Your home is now under our protection. Any warrior who passed this way will know you as friend. Any Apache who see trouble come to you will stop it. The weight of those words settled over Kier slowly. Protection, not just for today, but ongoing. Not just from this leader, but from his entire people. In a territory where tensions between settlers and tribes ran high, that kind of protection was worth more than gold. I don't need payment, Kier said quietly. I just did what anyone should do, the sister translated, and something that might have been a smile crossed the leader's face. Brief and restrained, but real. He responded, and she translated again. Fathers say that is why you deserve protection, because you think this is what anyone should do. She paused. He say most men not like you. Most men see Apache daughters and see enemies, or worse, see opportunity to harm. You see only people who need help. The leader stepped closer to Kier, close enough that the difference in their heights didn't matter, close enough that Collier could see the weathered lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his hair. He spoke directly to Collier, And even without translation, the meaning was clear in his tone and his eyes. The sister translated anyway. He say, he is Napishni, he wanted to know his name. Because you're now friend to his family. Napishni extended his hand in the white man's tradition, a gesture of adaptation of meeting someone halfway across the cultural divide. Collier took it, feeling the strength in that grip and the weight of the promise it carried. Collier Brennan, he said, and I'm honored. PC nodded once, then turned to his daughters. He spoke to them at length, his voice carrying both authority and tenderness. A father who'd spent the night fearing for his children and now stood face to face with the man who'd kept them safe. The fevered daughter's eyes filled with tears. The healthy one stood straighter, her expression complex but no longer hostile. The warriors began mounting their horses, not in retreat, but in conclusion. Their purpose fulfilled, their leader judgment delivered. Within minutes, the circle that had surrounded Collier's property began to disperse. Warriors riding out in pairs and small groups, heading back toward wherever they come from. But Napishni remained, his daughters at his side, looking at Kier with something that transcended language and culture. Respect between men who'd stood on opposite sides of an invisible line and found common ground. Anyway, Nepni spoke to his daughters, and they moved back into the cabin to gather what few belongings they brought with them. Kier watched them go, feeling the strangeness of the moment. 12 hours ago, they'd been strangers at his door, and now they were leaving as something else entirely. Not quite friends. The gap between their worlds was too vast for that, but not strangers anymore either. The healthy sister emerged first, helping her sister, who still moved with the careful steps of someone recovering from serious illness. They approached, their father speaking quietly to him in their own language. He listened, then turned to Kier, studying him with that same measuring gaze from before. When Napi spoke, the healthy sister translated again. Father asked if you live alone here. Collier nodded. For 3 years now. He asked why you choose this to be alone, far from your people. The question cut deeper than Collier expected. He looked at the cabin, at the land he'd built a life on through sheer stubbornness and refusal to let grief consume him entirely. My wife died, he said simply. Fever took her. After that, being around people just reminded me of what I'd lost. Oh, it's easier, the sister translated. And something shifted in Napishni's expression, of recognition of shared pain. He responded and she translated. Father say he understand this. He lose his wife too many seasons ago. He say, loneliness is sometimes easier than memory. They stood in silence for a moment. Two men who'd lived entirely different lives, but had both learned the same hard lesson about loss and survival. Collier realized that. Understanding transcended language and culture. That grief spoke the same language everywhere. Napisi continued, speaking, his tone more serious now. The sister translated carefully. Father say, world is changing. More settlers come every season. More conflict between peoples. He say men like you are rare. Men who see people instead of enemies. She paused, choosing her words. He say, this make you valuable, but also make you target. Target for who? Kier asked. For both sides, she said quietly. Settlers who think you betray your own kind by helping Apache. Apache who think you trick us. Use kindness as weapon. She looked uncomfortable delivering this message. Father say you should know this. Know the protection he offer is real, but also necessary, because kindness make enemies in world full of hate. Collier absorbed that truth slowly. He'd spent 3 years avoiding the conflicts of the territory, building his life in isolation specifically to escape those tensions. And in one night, by doing what he thought was simply decent, he'd position himself directly in the middle of something much larger than himself. I understand, he said. And he did. The protection Neps offered wasn't just honor, it was survival. Neps spoke again, and this time his tone carried what sounded like instructions. The sister translated, Father say, if you ever need help, you light fire at night. 3 fires in triangle. Any Apache warrior who see this will know you call for protection, and they will come. 3 fires in a triangle. Collier repeated, committing it to memory. A signal that could mean the difference between life and death if the wrong people decided he'd crossed a line by helping the wrong strangers. The fevered sister stepped forward, then moving carefully to Collier. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Collier saw a bracelet woven from leather and decorated with small beads and patterns he didn't recognize but found beautiful. Anyway, she spoke directly to him for the first time, her voice still weak but sincere. Her sister translated, Kimla say this. Belong to our mother. She say you remind her of stories mother told about good men. Men who help because helping is right, not because they want something back. The healthy sister's voice caught slightly. She say she wants you to have it to remember that kindness matter even when world say it should not. Collier took the bracelet with careful hands, understanding the weight of what was being offered. This wasn't payment. It was connection. A physical reminder that on one night in one small cabin, the lines that divided people had blurred enough for humanity to show through. I'll treasure it, he said, and meant it completely. Napishni mounted his horse, and his daughters did the same on horses that had been brought for them. The last of the warriors had already departed, leaving only the 3 of them, and Kier standing in the morning light that now felt warm instead of threatening. Napisi looked down at Collier from horseback, and for a moment neither man moved. Then the Apache leader placed his hand over his heart and extended it toward Collier. The same gesture his warriors had made earlier. But coming from him, it carried additional weight. This wasn't just acknowledgement. It was a promise. Collier returned the gesture, feeling awkward with the unfamiliar motion, but wanting to honor it properly. Pishni nodded once, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. Then he turned his horse and began riding away. His daughters followed, but before they disappeared over the ridge, both sisters turned back to look at Collier one final time. The healthy sister, Aida, he'd learned her name was, raised one hand in farewell. Kimla, still weak but recovering, did the same. Then they were gone. 3 figures fading into the landscape until they became part of the horizon itself. Kier stood alone in front of his cabin, the morning sun now fully risen, warming the earth after the cool night. The property looked exactly as it had yesterday. Same wooden structure, same fence line, same empty corrals needing repair, but everything felt different. The isolation that had been his refuge for 3 years suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison he'd built for himself. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork. Someone's mother had made this, had worn it, had died, and her daughter had carried it as a reminder of love and loss. And now Kimi Mela had given it to a stranger because he'd done something she considered worthy of remembering. The weight of that gesture settled on him slowly. He'd spent 3 years convinced that staying away from people was the only way to avoid more pain, that isolation was safety, that the world was too hard and too cruel to risk connecting with anyone. But last night had proven something different. Last night had shown him that sometimes the world presented moments where you either became part of the cruelty through inaction or you pushed back against it by doing something decent. And those moments didn't care about your fears or your grief or your carefully constructed walls. They just demanded a choice. Collier walked back into his cabin. The bed was unmade, blankets twisted from where 2 sick women had slept fitfully. The pitcher of water still sat on the side table half empty. The chair in the corner bore the imprint of his weight from a long night of watching over strangers. He should clean up, get back to the daily routine of maintaining a property this size alone. There was fence to mend, wood to chop, a dozen tasks that had been waiting for his attention. But instead, he sat down in that chair and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. He'd been visited by 150 warriors at dawn, had stood face to face with a war leader who could have ordered his death with a single word, had been judged by a father protecting his daughters and had, somehow, impossibly been found worthy of protection in return. But more than that, he'd connected with other people for the first time in 3 years, had seen fear and gratitude and respect in their eyes, had been reminded that he was still capable of affecting the world around him, that his actions still mattered. The loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor suddenly felt less like necessity and more like a choice he'd been making every day. A choice to keep the world at a distance because engaging with it hurt too much. Collier stood and moved to the door, looking out at the property he'd built. The sun was climbing higher, promising a warm day. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from other homesteads. Neighbors he'd spent 3 years avoiding. People he'd convinced himself he didn't need. He tied the bracelet around his wrist, feeling the leather settle against his skin, a reminder, a promise to himself that the man who'd opened his door to strangers last night wouldn't close it again. Just because morning had come and the danger had passed. The world was still hard, still cruel in places, still full of conflicts he couldn't solve and tensions he couldn't ease, but was also full of moments. Like last night. Moments where choosing kindness over fear made all the difference. And maybe Keir thought as he stepped out into the sunlight, it was time to stop hiding from those moments. 2 weeks passed before Keir truly understood what Nepni's protection meant. He'd been working on the eastern fence line when he noticed the riders approaching. 3 men on horseback, moving with the casual confidence of people who believe they owned whatever land they crossed. Collier recognized the type immediately, drifters the kind of men who measured opportunity by vulnerability and saw isolated homesteads as easy targets. They rode straight up to where Keir stood, tools in hand, and the lead rider smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice property you got here," he said, his gaze sweeping across the land with obvious calculation. "Awful lot of work for one man alone." Collier set down his tools carefully, his mind already calculating distances and odds. 3 against 1. No weapon within easy reach. The cabin too far away to run for shelter. The same arithmetic that had haunted him the morning he'd faced 150 warriors. Except this time the numbers were smaller, but the danger felt more immediate and personal. "I managed," Collier said evenly. The second rider circled around behind him, cutting off any retreat path. "See, that's the thing about managing alone," he said. "Accidents happen. Fences catch fire, livestock wander off, man can get hurt without anyone around to help him." It wasn't subtle. It was a threat delivered with the expectation that Collier would either pay them to leave or would try to fight and lose. They'd done this before, probably many times, to men who had no choice but to submit or suffer. But Collier wasn't alone anymore, even if these 3 didn't know it yet. He looked past the riders to the ridge line beyond his property. At first, there was nothing. Then movement, subtle but unmistakable. 3 Apache warriors on horseback, positioned where they could see everything happening in Keir's yard. They made no move to approach, no aggressive gesture. They simply sat there visible and watching, their presence alone changing every calculation the 3 drifters had made. The lead rider followed Keir's gaze and went very still. His companions noticed the warriors at the same moment, their casual, threatening postures evaporating into something closer to panic. "You're under Apache protection," Collier said, quietly. It wasn't a boast or a threat, just a statement of fact. "They watched this property. They watched me." The lead rider's face had gone pale. Everyone in the territory knew what it meant to interfere with someone under tribal protection. It meant retaliation, swift, certain, and without mercy. It meant making enemies of people who knew this land better than any settler ever would. The 3 men turned their horses and rode away faster than they'd arrived, not looking back, their opportunistic threats forgotten in their rush to put distance between themselves and the warriors on the ridge. Collier looked up at the Apache scouts. One of them, a young warrior he didn't recognize, raised his hand in acknowledgement. Collier returned the gesture. Then the three warriors turned their horses and disappeared over the ridge. Silent guardians who'd been there the whole time, watching over a man who'd shown kindness to two sisters when he could have turned them away. That night, Collier sat on his porch and looked at the bracelet on his wrist, feeling its familiar weight. The isolation he'd built his life around for 3 years had been shattered by one decision to help strangers. And in its place was something better. Not solitude, but connection. Not hiding, but protection. Not loneliness, but the knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself. He thought about the morning. He'd woken to find 150 warriors surrounding his cabin. How certain he'd been that his decision to help would cost him everything. How wrong he'd been about what everything meant. Because he hadn't lost anything that morning. He'd gained something he hadn't even known he was missing. A place in a world that was bigger and more complicated than the borders of his property, but also more generous than he'd given it credit for. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light. Somewhere out there, Nepni and his daughters were living their lives, probably not thinking about the white man who'd given them shelter. But they'd left him with more than protection. They'd left him with a reminder that the world rewarded goodness, sometimes in ways you couldn't predict or plan for. Here Brennan had offered his bed to two exhausted Apache sisters. By dawn, their father had arrived with 150 warriors, and instead of ending his life, they'd given him a reason to truly live it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where courage and compassion lives in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.